It is 3 o'clock in the morning, February 20th, 1944. A briefing room somewhere in East Anglia. The lights are hard and electric. A length of red string runs across a map of Europe. Out of England, across the North Sea, deep into the center of Germany, past Leipzig, past Brunswick, past Merseburg. The men in their seats know what the string means. They know because they have sat in these chairs before, pulled on their gear, taxied to the runway, waited for a red flare from the control tower. Mission cancelled. Back to the huts, back to the cots. 3 weeks of it. Dark clouds over East Anglia, every morning, without relenting. This morning, the briefing officer keeps talking. Out on the flight line, in the dark before dawn, the shapes of B-17S and B-24S line the edges of the runway. Dozens of them, scores of them, stretching further than the eye can follow in the fog. Crew chiefs walk their pre-flight checks. Ground crews heft bomb loads into open bays. And then, one by one, the engines begin to turn. A cough, a shudder, a roar that builds until it encompasses everything. 1,000 engines firing into an English winter morning. The sound carries 20 miles. At Bushy Park, 170 miles south of the bomber bases, Lieutenant General Carl A. Spotts has been awake since before midnight. The weather forecast is bad. The risks, icing, collisions in cloud, formations scattered before they even cross the coast, are real and documented. His most celebrated subordinate, Major General James H. Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, has advised against launching. Doolittle is many things. The first man to bomb Tokyo, the first to bomb Rome, the first to bomb Berlin from the west, a man who keeps his own fighter plane to roam the sky above the aircraft he commands. He is, in the phrasing of one historian, the master of the calculated risk. On the night of February 19th, his calculation is that this launch falls on the wrong side of that line. Spatz hears him out. The forecast, the numbers, the objections. 3 words. Let him go. 1,000 aircraft move toward Germany. What the men inside those aircraft have been told is that they are going to bomb factories, aircraft plants at Leipzig, assembly lines at Merseburg, production facilities at Brunswick. They know their targets. What they have not been told, what most of them will never know, is that the factories are not the point. By the logic of the operation's own planners, the bombers are not the weapon. The Luftwaffe fighters are the target, and the bombers and the men inside them are the bait. The man who gave the order did so over the explicit objections of his most celebrated subordinate. What those men are about to do will change the course of the war, not in the way anyone planned. What brought 1,000 bombers to the skies over East Anglia on that February morning was the wreckage of the year before. In the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces operated on a theory. It was clean and it was confident. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were heavily armed aircraft, 13.50 caliber machine guns on a Flying Fortress alone. They flew in tight combat box formations designed so each aircraft covered the others. American commanders believed these planes could defend themselves against anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. The theory was tested on August 17, 1943. Over the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. 60 aircraft lost, 87 so badly damaged they never flew again, in a single day. They tried again on October 14th. The second raid on Schweinfurt, Black Thursday, another 60 bombers gone. When the numbers came in that evening, the commanders canceled deep daylight missions into Germany. The 8th Air Force needed time. In aircraft, in crews, in the simple fact of men who had seen too much too fast and needed to still be alive to fly again. The problem was the calendar. Somewhere in 1944, there would be a cross-channel invasion. Its success depended on air supremacy over France and Germany. Air supremacy required defeating the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe was shooting down American bombers faster than the factories back home could replace them. The answer arrived in the form of a single aircraft. The North American P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under, licensed by Packard, with drop tanks extending its range beyond 750 miles. It could reach Berlin and come home. Fighter squadrons converted as deliveries arrived through the winter. The question was whether enough of them would reach the front before the invasion window closed. The D-Day clock was running. Every mission, every calculation, every acceptable loss, all of it in service of a deadline that could not move. Operation Argument was built on a dual logic. Destroy the German aircraft industry. Bomb the factories that built Messerschmitts, that assembled Focke-Wulfs, that produced the ball bearings everything else depended on. That was what the targeting lists said. What the targeting lists did not say, what existed in the operational thinking of the men who designed it, was the second purpose. Force the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition. Send bombers to targets Germany could not afford to leave undefended. Let the fighters rise and kill them. Doolittle understood this logic and pushed it further. He reorganized how the escort fighters operated. Instead of holding close to the bomber formations, defensive, reactive, the fighters now ranged out ahead, hunting. They flew sweeps before the bombers arrived, then roamed far from the bomber stream after the bomb run, chasing anything that moved. The bomber crews hated it. They felt exposed. They were right. They were also, by design, the reason the Luftwaffe would have to fight. For the men climbing into those bombers, the arithmetic of survival was already grim. A standard tour in the 8th Air Force ran 25 missions. In 1943, before the Mustang arrived, before the escort range extended, before the losses stabilized, completing 25 missions carried a survival probability of less than 1 in 4. Major General Frederick L. Anderson, Jr. had spent months planning this operation. He was 37. West Point trained, a man who had run the numbers in every configuration the data permitted. He'd arrived at a figure, 200 bombers lost on day 1. That was the worst plausible outcome he would accept. 200 aircraft, 2,000 men. He considered it the cost the operation required. On the German side, Adolf Galland had been reading the same arithmetic from the other direction. Galland was 31 years old. Germany's general of the fighter arm since 1941, the youngest general in the Wehrmacht at his appointment. He flew with a cigar clamped between his teeth and the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds at his collar. He had watched the Mustangs arrive since November 1943 and understood, with the precision of a man who had spent his adult life fighting in the air, what they meant. Pilot training had already been cut. Veterans from 3 fronts were being burned through faster than new pilots could be seasoned. He could see the trap closing. He could not stop it. The Luftwaffe was, in many ways, at its last genuine peak of strength. Flak batteries grown in number, fighter units recalled from the Eastern Front, veterans still numerous enough to lead arriving pilots. Formidable, and about to walk into a fight designed specifically to destroy what was most irreplaceable about it. February 20th, 1944. Before dawn, over the flat cold of East Anglia, 1,000 aircraft climb through winter cloud and turn east. This is the first time more than 1,000 bombers have been dispatched in a single mission. The 8th Air Force sends 1,003 bombers and 835 fighters. The RAF contributes 16 fighter squadrons for escort. The scale of what is forming up in the grey English sky has no precedent. Over Germany, cloud cover forces improvisation. Formations miss primary targets. Groups divert to secondary objectives. The 3rd Bombardment Division cannot find Tutow and bombs Rostock instead. Navigation suffers. Accuracy suffers. The morning is, by the operational record, chaotic. And then the results come in. Anderson is waiting for his number. 21 bombers, 4 fighters. Against an expected loss of 200, the first day of the largest air operation in American history costs 21 bombers. The Germans lose 153 fighters. The RAF, flying the previous night's raids, had already lost 79 of their own. Against all of that, against the weight of Anderson's worst-case planning, 21. That gap does not mean what happened was easy. 21 aircraft, 9 or 10 men each. Each crew had eaten what might have been a last meal in an East Anglian mess hall, had climbed into the cold of an unpressurized aluminum fuselage at 25,000 feet, where the temperature holds at 40 below, and had encountered something they did not survive. The number is the smallest possible disaster. The disaster happened. On February 20th over Germany, a B-17 is hit. Staff Sergeant Archibald Matthys and Lieutenant Walter Truemper are aboard. Their pilot is dead or incapacitated. The co-pilot is critically wounded and cannot fly the aircraft home. Matthys and Truemper are not wounded. They could leave the aircraft. They choose not to. Their crewmates cannot survive a parachute jump. So Matthys and Truemper stay. They bring the B-17 back across Germany, across France, back to England. On the approach to landing, something goes wrong. Both men are killed. The planners, by the logic of their own operation, had designated the bombers as bait, expendable lures, the instrument by which the Luftwaffe would be drawn up and destroyed. Faced with the choice between their own survival and the lives of their crewmates, Matthys and Truemper chose their crewmates. That same day, a badly damaged B-17 crosses the channel with its pilot, First Lieutenant William Lawley, flying wounded and alone. 2 of his gunners are too badly hurt to bail out. He does not order them to. He nurses the aircraft to the English coast, where one engine runs out of fuel and another catches fire. He crash lands at a small fighter base. His entire crew survives. 3 medals of honor in a single day, the day that was supposed to be a catastrophe. They fly again on February 21st, 861 bombers, 679 fighters. The weather closes in over the targets. No formation reaches its primary objective. All divert. Losses mount before a German fighter fires a round. Aircraft colliding in cloud during the climb out, gone before they cross the coast. Among the dead on day 2 is Sergeant Seymour Pliss. His father had already died. He was the breadwinner, supporting his mother and teenage sister back home. He had enlisted voluntarily. His mother and sister always felt he shouldn't have been accepted. He died in February, over Germany, far from anyone who loved him. It was not an unusual story. It was almost every story. On February 22nd, formation problems delay and disorder the launch. Of 252, B-24 Liberators readied, 177 take off. Only 74 reach their targets. Several aircraft are destroyed in accidents during assembly before they cross the coast. Day 3. Another number in the record, and the record moves on. February the 23rd, bad weather grounds the operation. Maintenance crews work through the night on damaged aircraft. Crews sleep. Planners revise targeting lists for a final push. February 24th. The weather over most of Germany clears. 860 bombers and nearly 800 escort fighters strike deep. The 2nd Air Division's target is the Messerschmitt aircraft plant at Gotha, 420 miles due east of the English coast. At Tybenham in Norfolk, Major James Maitland Stewart watches his aircraft taxi out. He is 35, tall and angular, a man whose face the country knows from films. He is also a squadron commander, and a man who fought to be here. The Army Air Forces spent more than a year trying to keep him safely stateside, assigning him to training posts and ferrying duties and public appearances, everywhere except where the war was actually happening. He persisted until they let him fly. He is here by choice. That morning, 28 aircraft take off from Tiebenham. 3 turn back over the Channel. Of the 25 that press on to Gotha, 12 return. One of them is a B-24 named Dixie Dewdrop. It is the only aircraft from Stuart's 703rd Bomb Squadron to land back at Tiebenham that afternoon. Stuart meets the crew for interrogation. He asks his questions. He listens to what happened to the rest of them. And then tears come to his eyes, and he leaves the room for a little while. He does not perform this. No audience is watching. A crew member will remember it decades later. That is the entirety of what is known. The questions, the details, the tears. The door. From a German airfield somewhere in central Germany, the week looks entirely different. Galland has watched the Mustangs appear above his formations and understood what they represent. The arithmetic he had been calculating since November has reached its conclusion. The Luftwaffe's fighters must rise to meet the American bombers. Because the factories being targeted are the factories that build the aircraft the Luftwaffe flies, and if those factories burn, the problem accelerates beyond recovery. They must defend. Every time they defend, the Mustangs are waiting. For years, the Luftwaffe had built and deployed its heavy twin-engine fighters, the Bf-110 and the Me-410, designated Zerstörer, destroyer, specifically to attack bomber formations. They carried rockets and heavy cannons designed to tear apart tight American combat boxes from long range before closing with guns. Against unescorted bombers, they were lethal. They had proven it. Against P-51s, they are flying coffins. Too heavy, too slow in a turn, too committed to their attack vectors to evade a fighter that outclasses them at every altitude. The Zerstörer units are shredded in the first days of the week. By the end, they are withdrawn from Western operations entirely. Years of optimization for one threat. They walked into another. The Luftwaffe pilots are not outclassed in will or in skill. The veterans who rise to meet the bombers over Leipzig and Brunswick know how to fight. The problem is not talent. The problem is the geometry of the trap. Fight and be massacred by the escorts, or don't fight and watch the factories burn. Either path leads the same direction. On February 25th, the final day, the 15th Air Force, operating from bases in southern Italy, hits Regensburg and Augsburg from the south, while the 8th presses from the north. The German defense splits against 2 converging attacks it was never designed to handle simultaneously. By the end of the day, General Joseph Schmid, commander of the 1st Fighter Corps, puts his assessment on paper. In the long run, he writes, our forces are fighting a hopeless battle. He is not wrong. He does not yet fully know why. When the final tallies come in, the Allied commanders look at what their aircraft have delivered. In 6 days, the 8th Air Force alone drops nearly 18,000 tons of bombs, more tonnage in 5 days than in the entire previous year of the war. Leipzig, Gotha, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Augsburg, Brunswick, Bernburg, hit and hit again, and hit a 3rd time. Factory roofs caved in, assembly lines halted. The damage assessments show ruin. The cost has been significant. The 8th loses 137 bombers, the 15th 89, the RAF 131. American fighters, 28. Behind those figures are approximately 2,600 American airmen killed, wounded, captured, or missing in 6 days. Harris's bombers, sent in against his explicit objections, Air Chief Marshal Portal had to order him to comply, suffer some of the worst losses of the operation. The one senior commander who had to be compelled now watches his crews bleed in service of a doctrine he had spent years opposing, a doctrine whose success, in the end, vindicates his opponents rather than himself. After the war, Harris is the only senior Allied commander denied a campaign medal for his crews, the only one passed over for the peerage given to every man around him. The record of why is complicated. The record of what it cost him is not. Doolittle, who had advised against the opening day's launch and been overruled, would in time become the dominant name in the history of Big Week. His fighter doctrine, his reorganization of the escort mission, the stamp of his personality on the 8th Air Force. Spatz, who had heard the objections, weighed them and said 3 words, would become the quieter figure. Both men's contributions were real. History found one name easier to keep. The commanders return from the week convinced they understand what they have achieved. They have struck the German aircraft industry at the moment of maximum vulnerability. They have broken production lines. They write their reports, cite the damage assessments, move toward the invasion. They believe what the photographs show them. They are not entirely wrong about what they did. They are wrong about the most important thing. Armaments Minister Albert Speer had spent the autumn of 1943 dispersing German aircraft production. Assembly lines moved to satellite facilities, to rural workshops, to underground sites spread across the Reich. The bombs fell on the original factory locations and found less than they expected. Germany did not build fewer aircraft after Big Week. Germany built more. Fighter production increased month by month, through the summer and into the autumn of 1944. The Reich reached a peak of just over 40,000 aircraft that year, more than any year before it. The assembly lines the Americans believed they had broken were running, relocated, turning out Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs faster than at any point in the war. General Jeschonnek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, had remarked cheerfully in 1942 that he wouldn't know what to do with more than 300 fighters a month. By 1944, Germany was producing thousands. It wasn't enough. The most important consequences of Big Week were not understood by Allied commanders until after the war had ended. The factories kept producing. What did not recover, what could not be dispersed or relocated or rebuilt from components, were the pilots. Germany lost more than 100 experienced pilots over those 6 days. Not young men in their first combat tour. Veterans, the men who had learned their trade over Spain, over France, in the Battle of Britain, across 3 years of attrition on the Eastern Front. The men who knew how to read a bomber formation, how to lead a staffel, how to bring an arriving young pilot through his first engagements alive. Those men died over Leipzig and Brunswick and Schweinfurt in February 1944. Germany trained replacements, desperately shortening the programs, sending boys into cockpits with fewer hours than any Air Force had previously considered acceptable. Experience cannot be manufactured. The veterans were in the ground. Germany built 40,000 aircraft in 1944. The planes sat on dispersed airfields across the Reich, waiting for pilots who were not coming. 4 months later, June 6, 1944, the Normandy coast, the largest amphibious operation in history. Nearly 160,000 men crossing the Channel in the first 24 hours. 5,000 ships, the beaches at low tide crowded with men running toward a wall. The invasion planners had built the Luftwaffe into their calculations. They expected German fighters over the beaches, over the landing craft, over the men in the surf. They constructed their air cover around the assumption that the sky above Normandy would be contested. The sky above the beaches is nearly empty. Across the entire first day of the invasion, Luftwaffe sorties over the landing zone are a fraction of what Allied planners had projected. The German pilots, who might have turned those exposed men in the water into a different kind of story, are not there. Not because the factories were bombed and failed to rebuild, because the pilots died in February and could not be replaced. By the time the landings came, the 8th Air Force had so thoroughly broken the Luftwaffe's capacity to contest the air that American fighters ranged freely across Germany, strafing anything that moved. The organization that had come within a few dozen aircraft of stopping the American bomber campaign in 1943 could no longer mount a coherent defense of its own skies. Nobody who ordered the February raids understood this in real time. Nobody who flew them understood it either. They thought they were going to bomb factories. The bombs were real, the targets were real, the damage was real, the decisive consequence was invisible to everyone who produced it. Living in the absence of men who were no longer there to fly aircraft that sat by the thousands, grounded and waiting. The engines fired on a flight line in East Anglia in the dark before dawn. The men climbed in and flew east into February. They thought they were going to bomb factories. They changed the war.